Southern Gothic is a podcast that explores the history behind some of the American South's darkest days, greatest mysteries, and most chilling ghost stories. On the night of July 24th, 1979, people flocked to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City to attend a star-studded gala event celebrating the world premiere of a new American supernatural horror film called the Amityville Horror. Adapted from the 1974 book of the same name, it was marketed as a true story, an adaptation of the real-life struggles of George and Kathy Lutz, who purchased a home where a horrific mass murder had taken place, only to discover that the house itself was haunted by an evil and violent supernatural force. Now, critics didn't treat the film too kindly, and skeptics questioned the veracity of its alleged claims, but the Amityville Horror was a commercial success, grossing over $86 million at the box office and boasting the biggest opening weekend of any other movie that summer, influencing the horror genre for decades to come. While the earlier films of the 1970s had been influenced by themes of a satanic panic as seen in The Exorcist and The Omen, the Amityville Horror reignited the public's fascination for the haunted house, a genre that, according to author Colin Dickey, strikes a very particular nerve in American culture.
There are haunted structures of all kinds: churches, hotels, toy stores. There are haunted bridges and haunted alleyways, haunted parks and haunted parking lots. But in the United States, the most common, the most primal haunted place is a house. Home ownership has always been intertwined with the American dream. We have magnified this simple property decision in part because it represents safety and security. The haunted house is a violation of this comfort. The American dream gone horribly wrong.
Throughout the film, viewers watch as the Lutz family's life gradually declines the longer they inhabit their new home, a place that was initially a symbol of hope, until eventually whatever evil force there becomes so intense, they're forced to run for their lives in one final climactic scene that not only resembles Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, but makes use of the now classic horror cliché of blood streaming down the walls of the home. Imagery that suggests that this inanimate structure the family had hoped would be their safe haven is actually a living entity, a trope that has continued to be used in the horror genre to this very day. While the imagery of bleeding walls has become a bit of a cliche, that didn't stop a retired couple down in Atlanta from experiencing something eerily similar in their home less than 10 years later. It is a fully documented and verifiable mystery that has never been explained. And as a result, this home has earned its place in modern lore as the Atlanta Blood House. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic. On Tuesday, September 8th, 1987, at around 11:30 p.m., 77-year-old Minnie Clyde Winston stepped out of her bathtub onto the tile floor and felt something sticky underneath her foot. Towel in hand, she looked down and discovered that she was standing in a small puddle of red liquid. At first, Minnie wasn't all that alarmed. As she later told the newspapers, it didn't look like blood and it didn't smell like blood. But upon the realization that her husband Willie might be injured, she quickly left the bathroom and headed toward the bedroom where they slept. When Minnie entered the hallway, though, she was confronted with the sight of something even more chilling than she had just encountered. All along the hallway, on the walls and floor, were half-dollar-sized globs of what seemed like blood. Fortunately, when she got to the bedroom, Minnie found Willie fast asleep without any sign of injury or cause to worry, so she woke him up and the pair began walking through their house to see if they might be able to figure out exactly what this red blood-like substance was and where it might be coming from. To their surprise, they found it in almost every single room of the house: the kitchen, living room, bedroom, the hallway, and even in the basement. According to Minnie, it looked as if the liquid had come out of the floor like a sprinkler. The couple's initial concern was that someone was injured in the home, but the house only had 6 rooms and there wasn't exactly anywhere for an intruder to hide. Not to mention, all the external doors were locked and the home security system hadn't gone off after Minnie said it earlier that night at around 9:30. So you can imagine it didn't take long for the Winstons' confusion to give way to fear, and they called 911 for assistance. When the police and EMTs arrived, they confirmed that there were no signs of a break-in and neither Minnie nor William had been injured or were bleeding. Not a single scratch. And here's the thing, Willie was a frail, rail-thin 79-year-old man who required daily dialysis treatment, so it was understandable why the first responders felt the need to check the couple first. But after they did and went on to inspect his home dialysis machine to rule out that that hadn't malfunctioned or leaked, Atlanta Police Detective Richard Price figured the only plausible explanation was that a wounded animal must have gotten in. But the Winstons did not have any pets, and Minnie insisted that there are no rats, mice, or roaches in the house. The entire affair was truly baffling, and the police failed to find any evidence that would help explain how or why this mysterious substance had appeared in the Winstons' home.
"It's an extremely strange situation," said Detective Steve Cartwright, who examined the house early Wednesday morning. "I've been on the force 10 years and I've never seen anything like this." He said that no crime had been committed and that nothing was found to indicate any wrongdoing. In order to keep reporters and curious passers-by out of the house, Price declared it a crime scene.
Minnie and Willie Winston had been married for 44 years, and half of that time they had been living here at 1114 Fountain Drive Southwest, a simple brick bungalow home with green shutters, 6 rooms, and a small front lawn divided by a concrete walkway. It was located in the Mosley Park neighborhood, a working-class black community about 3 miles west of downtown Atlanta. The couple had been retired for several years at this point, Minnie having worked as a maid in a private home and Willie a porter in an office building for the National Screen Service Company. They also had 3 children, but at this point they were all grown, and as far as I can tell, if they had ever lived with their parents on Fountain Drive, they would have been older teenagers when they moved in, so by all accounts, this was a pretty typical elderly Atlanta couple, faced with an incredibly strange occurrence. Well, not long after the police arrived, the property managers came to see for themselves. Albert and A.J. Smith were a father-son duo, and their concern was that maybe a pipe had burst or Something had happened to cause a leak, but they too found absolutely nothing. Although, when the Smiths went down into the dugout-style basement, they found more of that liquid. There were several splotches on the stairs and a pool underneath the television. No one had any answers. Nothing was broken, the equipment all worked, the house was locked and secure with no sign of an intruder. The Winstons were not injured and they didn't own any pets. So most on the scene assumed that the red substance had to be something other than blood, like rust-contaminated water or paint. But with nothing else to go on, the police went ahead and called for someone in forensics to come down and take samples. Brenda Dipple, a 28-year-old lab tech from Texas, was tasked with this assignment, which she took very seriously, meticulously collecting evidence throughout the house, photographing the splotches and spatter, and taking samples for analysis. It said that Dipple even took a little bit of grief from some of the officers there because when she started to head down to the basement, she got a little reluctant and told them, quote, "This house gives me the creeps." Sure enough, Dipple's instincts were correct, because when the lab results came back a few days later, everyone knew for certain this was human blood. And if that wasn't wild enough, the blood was type O, and both of the Winstons and their children were type A. Now, you can only imagine what happened when this news began to break across Atlanta. The media went nuts, and it wasn't too long before the story hit national news with headlines like "Bleeding House Case Puzzles Police," "Mysterious Human Blood Turns Up in Couple's Home," and "Atlanta's Blood House Remains a Mystery." As early as the night that it happened, folks were lining up on Fountain Drive to see what was going on at the Winstons' home. But now, the attention had grown exponentially, and both the police and the Winstons were receiving phone calls from all across the country. People desperate to get more information on the mystery, and not surprisingly, due to the implications here, psychics who were trying to insert themselves into the already bizarre circumstances. It didn't take long for Minnie to grow weary of all the attention. The Atlanta Journal reported on September 10th.
She said this morning that she was weary of all the hullabaloo stirred up by the bizarre story about the blood on the floors, walls, and several rooms in their home. "I still don't know where the blood came from," the 77-year-old Mrs. Winston said, "and I'm tired of all these people asking me all these questions. If anybody comes here today, I'm not going to open my door." The 6-room house on the corner of Fountain Drive and Morris Street that Mrs. Winston and her 79-year-old husband William have rented for 22 years was virtually besieged Wednesday by those intrigued by the mystery. The phone rang all night, people asking me questions, and upset Mrs. Winston said, "I'm fed up with all this." She said she had not found any new spots of blood last night or this morning.
After the mysterious spatter was confirmed to be human blood, the police investigation took a slight turn, as no longer were they searching for the cause of it all, but rather who the blood had come from. Initially, they thought it might be Willie's blood, since he had the home dialysis unit, but the revelation of the couple's blood types caused investigators to start looking at other options, searching for leads at places like local blood banks, entertaining the possibility that maybe the blood had been stolen. Yet this, too, proved to be a dead end. Unfortunately, the police seemed to have made their job even more difficult, as they had waited more than 13 hours before they called in state crime lab experts. Larry Howard, director of the lab, told the Atlanta Journal that the hesitation caused the blood to dry, hindering them from making a more complete analysis.
Howard said that tests of fresh blood easily can reveal the sex, race, and other aspects such as traces of drugs or alcohol. If we have to work with dry blood, an analysis can take at least twice as long, Howard said. It is harder, for example, to separate red cells from dried blood.
When asked why the delay happened, police officials said, quote, "They delayed contacting the lab because they first thought the blood spots might have been left by a wounded animal." In the end, they were left with little evidence and no lead to follow, and within a week, the police had moved on entirely, stating that they didn't see that any crime had been committed. But y'all know that this didn't stop folks from being intrigued by the whole affair, right? And the Winstons were now unfortunately left to deal with the onslaught of public curiosity alone. So what caused this strange occurrence to happen on that foggy September night? Well, depending on who you ask, it might have been a hoax or maybe, just maybe, something supernatural. While the mystery as to what happened at the Winstons' home has never been solved, a number of theories have sprung up over the years, and with the lack of reliable sources and verifiable facts, some of them have evolved in ways that dip into the supernatural. Interestingly enough, the early newspaper reports covering the event never seemed to attempt to answer this question, in spite of how much they might have enjoyed the eye-catching headlines. But within 2 years of that night in question, a 1989 book called Unexplained Mysteries of the 20th Century did just that, invoking the otherworldly as a possible cause for the Atlanta Bloodhouse. The authors included the tale in a chapter titled Things That Go Bump in the Night, insinuating that the event was the manifestation of a poltergeist. If this were the case, though, there'd probably be other signs or even other instances of the walls bleeding. As we've seen in other alleged poltergeist cases like the Surensey family spirit, this type of haunting tends to take place over an extended period of time, rather than merely sprinkling blood everywhere one night and then disappearing forever as had occurred here. On the other hand, maybe Minnie, who was tired of the attention that they'd already received, just decided to keep later instances to herself. The poltergeist explanation wasn't the only suggestion of the paranormal, though, as some have also said the event might be directly connected to the previous owner of the house, a man named Albert L. Thompson. Thompson was a regional race relations director for the Federal Housing Authority, but in 1950, when he was 41 years old, he was T-boned by a car while driving west at the intersection of Mitchell and Davis Streets. Thompson suffered severe injuries, including internal bleeding, but the driver who caused the accident, a white man named Dub Mitchell, was unharmed and was charged with nothing more than having faulty brakes, a pretty minimal punishment that was likely related to race, which was a reasonable assumption as it was 1951. The story goes that Thompson succumbed to his injuries in the home on Fountain Drive, and the bloody night that took place there over 30 years later, on September 8, 1987, just so happened to be on the anniversary of his death, allegedly a direct result of his spirit's anger over the horrible injustice that he suffered. However, this particular legend that has popped up to help explain the bleeding walls is historically inaccurate. While Albert Thompson was horribly injured by Dub Mitchell in a car accident back in '51, he actually survived and lived into his 60s, passing away in 1972. And no, that wasn't at Fountain Drive. Minnie and Willie were already residents there when Thompson passed. Yet another paranormal explanation that some have suggested plays into the same cliche that the Amityville Horror had used to explain what the Lutz family experienced on Long Island. The house must have been built on a native burial ground. Now, y'all, in both cases, this is entirely fabricated. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever to lend credence to this theory. However, it does give us a glimpse into the way local lore was impacted during this era. I mentioned Colin Dickey earlier. Well, in his book Ghostland, he claims our fascination with, quote, Indian burial lands goes all the way back to the 18th century, when Revolutionary-era poet Philip Freneau acknowledged the place he called home was in fact someone else's first. It was a poem titled Indian Burying Ground.
This sensationalized portrayal of native burial rites shouldn't be entirely surprising. What is surprising is how quickly the trope of a haunted Indian burial ground took root and spread throughout the rest of American culture. It's a legend that's become so ubiquitous that it's something of a cliche, showing up these days as often as not as a punchline in comedies, appearing everywhere from South Park to Parks and Recreation.
Of course, if Amityville Horror wasn't enough to cement this trope in mainstream culture, Stephen King's 1983 novel, Pet Sematary, and the subsequent success of its 1989 film adaptation certainly put the proverbial nail in the coffin. So it is understandable why folks in the 80s would have jumped to this conclusion. But again, when it came to both Fountain Drive and the Amityville house, there just isn't any truth to the native burial ground angle. Real or not, though, by 1994, the paranormal lore of the Atlanta Blood House had grown deep enough that a group of individuals called the Georgia Skeptics decided to investigate the supernatural allegations for themselves, publishing an account written by Rebecca Long in their, quote, electronic newsletter. Yeah, y'all, this was 1994. She claims that at the time, the police didn't believe that the blood was of a supernatural origin, asserting that Lieutenant Walker, who led the original investigation, told Long, quote, it was his professional opinion that someone had deliberately splattered the blood around the house as a hoax.
To investigate the Bleeding Walls story, several skeptics went to the Atlanta Police Department's Homicide Division to obtain more information. Dr. Joe Nickel, Larry Johnson, Rick Moan, and I discussed the case with Lieutenant H. Walker, who led the original investigation. We reviewed the actual police files, including color photographs of the scene which showed what appeared to be blood in various rooms of the Winston home. I subsequently obtained copies of several of the photographs through the Open Records Act. Our discussions with Lieutenant Walker and our review of the police records confirmed that the substance was human blood. It was indeed type O, whereas the Winstons were type A, and the police did rule out the possibility of any violent crime. However, Lieutenant Walker definitely did not subscribe to the poltergeist theory.
If this is the case, there are three plausible theories. The first is that the Winstons did this themselves. Apparently, and I will preface it by saying this is undocumented hearsay, the couple had issues with their children, and so they allegedly perpetrated this hoax in order to get their attention. Proponents of this theory think that somehow when Willie was going through dialysis at the local hospital, he snagged a couple extra bags of blood, which they then proceeded to spray and splatter in various locations throughout the home. Now, Obviously, this theory can't be ruled out, even to this day, but it doesn't really make sense. First of all, none of the medical facilities in the area reported missing blood, and second, the idea that two elderly people, one of who could barely move around and get around, just decided to smear blood all over their house is a little out there. On top of that, when the Winstons discovered the blood, they called the police, not their children. And then, upon receiving all of that attention that came with it, as I said earlier, Minnie was not very pleased with being in the public eye. I should note, though, one of their children was a burglary detective for the Atlanta police, so maybe take that into account. The second theory is that either one or all of the Winstons' children were responsible for the act. This could be plausible because their daughter was a nurse at a local hospital and had access to blood. Not to mention, if anyone had the code for the alarm or a key to get in the house, it would have been the kids. Rumors abound that the children wanted their parents to move into assisted living, and so this was either an attempt to scare them or get them committed. But this was also unsubstantiated. Police, on the other hand, had insinuated that it was possible the children wanted their parents institutionalized for financial reasons. But y'all, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. This was a working-class family who didn't even own the home they were living in, and the cost of putting them in a facility seems more of a financial burden than gain. Last but not least, the final theory is that the perpetrator was a stranger. Possibly neighborhood teens playing a prank or someone just trying to be malicious. If this were the case, though, how did they get into the locked house without tripping an alarm and go so far as to make a pool of blood in the bathroom where Minnie was soaking in the tub and didn't notice? As usual, all I can say is we will never know. After everything she had gone through, Minnie Winston herself couldn't even accept that the substance she found on that fateful night was what the crime lab reported it to be. "I still don't believe it's human blood," she told the Atlanta Constitution. "I don't care what they say." So maybe Mrs. Winston actually believed that it really did have a supernatural origin after all. But in order for her to stay in her home, this denial was her way of finding peace. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic. Southern Gothic is an independent podcast produced by Southern Gothic Media. This episode was researched by Loretta Allen, written by Brandon Schexnayder, and made possible through the support of our sponsors and listeners like you. Of course, if you're a fan of the show, but you're tired of all those pesky commercials and are even interested in bonus content, there are now ad-free versions available on all of your favorite apps. Just visit southerngothicmedia.com/listen for links to all of those services or check the show notes. And y'all, as always, thanks for listening.
Lucky Little Shacks.